This is Dan Schneider, and this is another edition of American Television with Mitchell Hadley. This time out, we're going to be talking about the roots of and the legacy of courtroom dramas throughout the 70-plus year history of television. But before we do that, Mitch, for those who have never seen you here or on your blog, can you give a little background about yourself?
Sure, Dan. It's good to be with you again. I am the author of the Electronic Mirror, which it's amazing how this book just magically appears, isn't it? But written The Electronic Mirror, which is a collection of essays on classic television and its relationship to American popular and historical culture. I also blog about this at the website itsabouttv.com, where we take a look at old TV guides, old programs, and again, their relationship and what they tell us about the evolution of American culture, particularly from the mid-century period through to today.
Mitch, we've done early shows going back to the 1940s and before about television. I would assume, maybe I'm wrong, but that courtroom dramas not only come from film, but there must have been some radio dramas. What were some of the early precursors to television courtroom dramas on radio?
Yes, one again, as we've seen with so many other shows on television, their roots lie in old-time radio. One of the earliest shows to make the transition to television was a show called Mr. District Attorney, which was a radio drama. It was loosely based on the life and career of Thomas E. Dewey, who was the district attorney in New York before he ran for president and was elected governor of New York. But the first great courtroom drama on television also has its roots in radio, and a lot of people aren't aware of that now. But Perry Mason, which was I think to this day thought of as the prototypical courtroom drama, even though it isn't really, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Perry Mason, although the character was in a series of best-selling books by Earl Stanley Gardner, Mason appears on radio in The Edge of Night, although we didn't think of it then as that. I mean, there was a Perry Mason radio drama. Gardner wasn't particularly enamored by it because it was kind of a soap opera, because Mason wasn't the only character in it. And so when it went to television, he didn't express any enthusiasm about it. He didn't want to be involved with television. So the radio version of it goes to television as The Edge of Night. And Mike Kerr, who is the district attorney in The Edge of Night, is the Mason character, essentially. And there had even been some talk about simply transferring that character intact into television. Didn't work out that way. So when Mason finally does make the leap to TV, when CBS is able to convince Gardner to go with a Perry Mason series, they have the open auditions for the role, and that's how Raymond Burr becomes Mason, and that's how Mason gets established as a drama. Now, I mentioned that it isn't really a courtroom drama, and it isn't. At heart, Perry Mason is a mystery, a whodunit. And in fact, that's the way it appears in TV Guide during its initial run on CBS. It's never listed as a drama, as most other courtroom dramas are. It's always called a mystery. And that's because only about half of each episode takes place in the courtroom. Sometimes it's more like 15 minutes. And with only a few exceptions, we never see the jury trial. What we see is something that most people probably were not familiar with up until then, which is the preliminary hearing. Now, in California, which is where the series takes place, there are two ways in which the state can obtain an indictment against a defendant. One is by going to the grand jury. The other is by having a preliminary hearing. And for those of you who are old enough to remember the O.J. Simpson case, that was a preliminary hearing. And so the prosecution presents its evidence to the judge. The judge is not there to determine guilt or innocence, but merely whether or not there is a sufficient amount of evidence to suggest the guilt of the client, of the defendant, in order for him to be put on trial. And what's unusual about the Mason series is that Mason almost always chooses to put on a defense at the preliminary hearing. That doesn't happen all the time. And he does it because he wants to, one, bring the case to a hasty conclusion, and two, defend the good name of his client. Because it's one thing to go through a preliminary hearing where the outcome could be being indicted for murder and standing trial for murder. It's another thing to actually be on trial for murder, where you've got a jury instead of a judge, where you really have that element of risk. And in the first few episodes of the first season of Perry Mason, you're more likely to see it go to a jury than a preliminary hearing. Cynically, I think a lot of people have suggested that the reason the TV series made such great use of the preliminary hearing is because you didn't have to cast 12 people to serve as the jury. And that's true, but the preliminary hearing is also more flexible, and let's be honest about it. Perry Mason as a series didn't always adhere to the letter of the law. There are some interesting, some funny things that happened during that series, and it would be much less likely to have those occur in an actual trial setting. But nonetheless, you have to accept a couple of things when you go into an episode of Perry Mason, which is great theater, by the way. It's one of my favorite shows, and it's partly because of the great performances, it's partly because of interesting storylines, and it's partly because the courtroom drama itself is great theater, great drama. And you have to understand two things, though. One, Mason's clients are always innocent. Amazing. But it's true. They are always innocent. And the second is that during the course of the trial or the hearing, Mason will not only prove the innocence of his client, and remember, all he has to do is show that there's a reasonable doubt. He doesn't have to prove his client is innocent. He only needs to show reasonable doubt. But not only will he demonstrate that his client is totally innocent, he will uncover the guilty party, something that the police are not able to do, something that the district attorney is not able to do. Perry Mason was on for 9 seasons. 9 seasons. Never once did the police arrest the right person. Never once did the DA indict the right person. And you know, why is this significant? Why are we talking about this when we're talking about courtroom dramas? It's because Perry Mason lays the foundation for what we will see in future legal dramas, whether they're in the courtroom or not. It lays the groundwork for what our expectations are. And coming into a series wherein the defense attorney, not the prosecutor, is the protagonist of the series, our expectations are that the police have made a mistake, that the DA has made a mistake. As I say, 271 cases Mason tried. That was always the case. And this is significant because it's impacting the audience. It inevitably has to impact the viewers. It conditions them to form certain opinions about the police and about the state in general. After all, what would you think of a police force that always accuses the wrong suspect, or a district attorney that always prosecutes them without any question? You have a show like Dragnet, on the one hand, which shows a very vigilant police force that stops at nothing to uncover the evidence and find the guilty party. On the other hand, you have Perry Mason, where apparently the police arrest the first person to come along who arouses any suspicion in them. They don't even bother to go through the stage of the prime suspect. There is only one suspect. As soon as they find him, boom, he's in the slammer, Mason's in court, and the show goes on. So this is significant for Mason. It's significant for the way people look at the judicial system, and it's significant for the way that television will adjust to it. We'll see this as we start to talk about some of the legal dramas that follow Mason and their attempts to kind of compensate for that emphasis.
In light of the attempted assassination on Donald Trump last week and the Secret Service failures, apparently, it seems that they're very Perry Mason-like universe. But I wanted to pick up on something, because literally just 30 seconds before you'd mentioned The Edge of Night, I was going to mention that as someone who watched soap operas, and I remember the 1980s as that show sort of fizzled. So I didn't know that The Edge of Night started on radio. I thought it was like in the late 50s that it was just a television soap opera. So
yeah, I'm not sure if it was on radio as The Edge of Night, or as Perry Mason, or as something else. But the show, whatever it was, I could look it up, but whatever it was that was on radio evolved into these two distinct programs, The Edge of Night and then much later Perry Mason.
Because The Edge of Night, in terms of the soap opera universe here in the U.S., is a very distinct show, in that it was basically a crime drama or melodrama, yes, rather than just being the typical weepy melodramas that housewives watched in the 60s and 70s.
And that was another thing about it too, is that The Edge of Night was the one soap opera that had a significant male audience to it.
Yeah.
Part of that is because of that. Part of that is because it almost always was aired later in the afternoon, when it would be more likely that men might be able to catch it after work.
But,
so it's very interesting.
But what you're stating is basically that The Edge of Night and Perry Mason exist in the same cinematic universe, as they say.
At least in radio, it does. I don't think, although you can't help but always smile a little bit when you take a look at some of the later episodes of Perry Mason and you see the actor who played Mike Kerr in The Edge of Night appearing in the series in Perry Mason, either as the defendant or as one of the characters that's adjutant to it, and that's always, I think, kind of humorous to see it, because the show, it doesn't really play it as an in-joke, but anybody who would have seen the show would recognize that there's kind of that inside joke going on.
So you mentioned Joe Friday and Dragnet, and that's sort of the template for the police procedural thing. Perry Mason, I guess we'd have to call it a melodrama. And I think of, and when people think of courtroom films, they think of something like 12 Angry Men. Was there ever a television equivalent of 12 Angry Men, where basically we're just given the behind the scenes thing? We just get maybe 5 minutes of prelude about the evidence, and then we're watching the deliberations?
I suppose to a certain extent the kind of show you're describing could almost be seen in a show like Divorce Court or Day in Court. Those were two very popular daytime shows, and they actually do fall into the category of being courtroom dramas, because all of the action takes place in the courtroom, even though, they're not. Well, certainly in Divorce Court, it's not a murder trial, although I suppose you could say that it's trying to avoid a murder. But Day in Court, they are representations, supposedly, of actual events, and they're expository in the sense that almost all of the information you get about the crime or about the contesting comes from the testimony rather than any kind of a flashback or any kind of a prelude. So in terms of being the purest kind of courtroom drama, I think you might have to concede the point to them.
So, but now the divorce court you're speaking of was in the 60s, right?
Yeah, 50s, 60s, yeah.
Were there actors there? Because the modern divorce court that came 25, 30 years later was sort of like, what was it, Judge Wapner, the People's Court.
Yeah. No, these shows were all staged with actors, and to one extent or another, they were, especially Day in Court. Day in Court did rely on transcripts, and they asked actors to portray these characters based on the information they had, but they didn't necessarily work with scripts. They worked with a character. And they were given the outlines of the character, the outlines of what the accusation was. All of the actors were given this, but then in some cases you would see an improvisation go on based upon what information the actors had been given. So those were all staged dramas in the sense that they all had actors in them. And incidentally, one of those fun facts about Day in Court, the bailiff, the announcer, we would say, the original announcer on Day in Court was Jim McKay, who goes on to be the host of Wide World of Sports on ABC. And but he was in Day in Court, and he writes about it significantly in his autobiography that it was so frustrating an experience to be on that show in terms of what the role he saw it playing in his career, that he almost had a nervous breakdown over it. So it's very interesting to see those kinds of tidbits. But yeah, I would have to say that that's probably the closest you come to a genuine courtroom setting.
Now, Alfred Hitchcock had his show from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, so there was some pretty good overlap with the Perry Mason years. Did Hitchcock ever stray into doing any episodes that were courtroom dramas?
Yeah, on occasion. Now that was not a regular part of the series, but on occasion the drama would take us to the courtroom, and usually it wasn't so much about the adjudication of justice as it was to provide some kind of an ironic point to the story. You might see a guilty party acquitted. You might see a twist in the tale, as it were, but it wasn't building up to that in the same sense that a modern legal drama would. I think that when you talk about that, the next stage in the evolution of the courtroom drama is probably The Defenders, which also runs on CBS, which in fact overlaps with Perry Mason. Not just that they were on for some of the same seasons and on the same network, but for a time they were on back to back on the same night. On Saturday night, you'd have Perry Mason and you'd have The Defenders, and you could compare the two shows right there and see the difference in them.
Well, The Defenders was more sort of the dragnet version of a court show, wasn't it not?
Yeah, The Defenders is I think, a landmark series in terms of the courtroom drama and in terms of the direction that these kinds of dramas are taking, because the creator of The Defenders, his name is escaping me at the moment, and I am embarrassed to say that. It'll come back to me. But the creator of The Defenders has this quote where he says, "The law is the subject of our programs, not crime, not mystery, not the courtroom for its own sake. We were never interested in producing a whodunit," which is what Perry Mason is, which is solved in a flashy courtroom battle of wits. So The Defenders is taking this to a different direction. It's talking about the law itself as an adjudicator of right and wrong. And again, that's only one of the major differences you see between Perry Mason and the defenders. You also see that not every case in the defenders is about murder. Sometimes the cases don't even make it into the courtroom, although most of them do. You see different kinds of venues in which the law can be debated. For instance, in the first season of The Defenders alone, there are 2 episodes that come in very close succession where Lawrence Preston, the E.G. Marshall character, is pressed into service as an ad hoc defense attorney in a setting which is extra legal. It's more like a star chamber or a kangaroo court, and he winds up being the defense attorney in this kind of a setting. And what he's doing is not only providing the defense of an innocent person, but he's trying to show the dangers of stepping outside the law to settle some of these things. One of the touchstones of the defenders is that the law really exists in and of itself, that it is something that needs to be practiced by specialists. It's not something that should be left to the ordinary person, and that the law has a sacrosanct vision within the way the United States is constructed, that the law is about more than just guilt or innocence. It's about rights and responsibilities. It's about the relationship of the state to the individual. It's about all these different things. And this is the way that the defenders was able to introduce so many different types of issues. As I say, it did take on murders, but it wasn't only murders. And so as a result, you had everything from free speech to racism, euthanasia, abortion, all these social issues that the law is forced to weigh in on, or that the law perhaps should weigh in on. And what that does is stress the importance of the rights of the individual. When you're talking about censorship, when you're talking about weighing the effect of what someone says on society versus the right of that person to be able to say it in public in the first place, then you're getting into an area where you're relying on the law to be the judge of what that difference is, where the distinction comes between the right of the individual and the right of society. Now, where the Avengers
the defenders.
fits in,
The defenders.
yes, I'm sorry, where the defenders fits into all of this is that the Prestons, father and son, E.G. Marshall and Robert Reed, where the defenders fit into all of this is that their prime concern, especially Lawrence Preston, the elder of the two, his prime concern is with exercising the role of the law. And at one point, when they're defending a client who may or may not be guilty, again, you'll remember Perry Mason, there's no doubt about it. We know that the client is innocent, not just not guilty, but innocent. On the other hand, in the defenders, Lawrence Preston isn't quite that interested in the guilt or innocence. In fact, sometimes he doesn't want to know whether they're guilty or innocent. It doesn't matter to the case because the power of the law rests in the ability of the state, the requirement of the state to prove a person's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. What makes the American legal system different from other legal systems, they are pointing out, is that it is not the responsibility of an innocent man to prove his innocence. It's the responsibility of the state to prove his guilt, again, beyond a reasonable doubt. And there are certain cases, situations where The younger Preston is sharply questioning his father about certain legal strategies that they're going to employ in a trial, whether it is a technicality or whether it's an other aspect of the law. And in essence, what the elder Preston says is that you have to look at the law as a mechanism that is there to guarantee everyone's rights. So if we use those mechanisms and happen to get a guilty person off, the law is not about acquitting the guilty man. It's about protecting the rights of the innocent man. So, in other words, you are justified in using a particular technique to get a man off who may be guilty, because you may need to use that same technique later on to defend the rights of an innocent person. And so that's a major distinction that we're making. As I said, there are no guilty clients in Perry Mason, but there are in the defenders. And another major difference between the two of them is that the Prestons don't always win.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yep. Sometimes their clients are convicted. Sometimes the ruling of the court is rather ambiguous. And there are even a couple of times where we don't find out the result of the trial. We don't know whether the client is convicted or acquitted. And that's because in cases like these, the story is not about the guilt or innocence of the person. It's about the issue that's being debated. So when you are debating freedom of speech, it's important for the show to get that idea out. It presents both sides of the issue. And having said that, I will say the Defenders was always identified as a politically liberal program. But the difference that you might see in the Defenders versus some later courtroom dramas is that the Defenders always took care to present both sides of the issue. They didn't always present them equally, but they didn't simply use the show as a mouthpiece for one side. They did make the effort to present both sides, to allow the debate to occur, and in turn to let the viewer start to appreciate those issues and see how they felt about it. Did it change the minds of the viewer? Did it influence the way that they think? That was one of the powerful parts of the Defenders, that it forced the viewer to really think, to consider.
So if Perry Mason would be considered melodrama, the Defenders, with its father and son focus, and also the fact that they lost cases, was that really realism, or was that, or did the show ever get a little bit too didactic?
Well, it did have that tendency to be didactic. As I say, it sometimes would. You can blunt that by saying that it did present both sides, but yes, sometimes when you're watching it, you feel like you might be watching an episode of William F. Buckley's Firing Line or Meet the Press or something like that. Not particularly because it's going to be so intellectually high that people aren't going to be able to follow it, but I would put it this way: the people in a show like The Defenders, the characters like to make speeches, and there are a lot of speeches, a lot of impassioned speeches, and the dynamic between the father and son becomes an important point in the show as it develops, and I'll just take a sidetrack to explain that. Lawrence Preston, the father, is an established attorney. He's experienced. He's conservative in his manner, if not in his politics. Kenneth Preston, the younger, has just gotten out of law school not that long ago. He's taken into the firm, so it's Preston and Preston. But he is more emotional. He's less logical. He's more impassioned. He's less reserved. And he's more inclined to be a crusader rather than simply a litigator. Now, that offers, over the 4 years that the Defenders ran, it offers the opportunity for him to learn from his father. And in that sense, it starts to resemble a program like Dr. Kildare, where you have the mentor. But it also works both ways, because in a sense, the younger Preston becomes the conscience of the team. And there are times when it's his impassioned opinion that changes the mind of his father, or at least alters the direction in which they go. It may convince the father to take the case. It may change the strategy that the father is looking at. In fact, in one case, it really does alter the way he looks at it, from defending somebody who may be guilty to defending a person that you know is innocent. That results in a completely different strategy that he employs, and a different technique in terms of the witnesses and the way that they're questioned. So that's a very interesting dynamic between the two of them. And what that does is it humanizes the characters, among other things, and it does soften the didactic nature of the show. But it also, but it does present the show with that crusading type of image, and as we'll see, that not only influences other legal dramas, it influences other dramas that aren't legal, and it influences the way people start to look at the law again.
Yeah. So if would it be correct then to say that Perry Mason and the Defenders are sort of the two foundational pillars of the courtroom drama? And if so, have most shows leaned one or the other way, or are they somewhere in the middle?
I would say that most shows, if you look at them carefully, to the extent that they follow one or the other, it kind of depends on when and where you are in the spectrum of cultural history. The shows that immediately followed the Defenders tended to run in the same direction as the Defenders. You had three really notable courtroom dramas or legal dramas that were contemporaneous to or followed in the footsteps of the Defenders. Those three were Sam Benedict, which starred Edmund O'Brien, Judd for the Defense, and Owen Marshall, Counselor at Law. And I think those latter two are probably a little better known than Sam Benedict.
Was Judd was that the Gene Barry show?
Oh, which one?
Gene Barry, Judd for the Defense?
No. Judd for the Defense starred, why am I having such a problem with names today? Because it's one of my favorite shows. Judd for the Defense starred the actor who used to be Donna Reed's husband, Carl Betts.
Okay.
So Carl Betts was,
in my mind, I thought that Gene Barry also had a show where he was a trial lawyer, or am I mistaken?
Well, he was in Burke's Law, where he was a millionaire police detective. We'll talk about that someday too. Okay. That's fun. But
we'll go on with the three you mentioned.
Yeah, but you had Carl Betts as Judd for the Defense, and you had Arthur Hill as Owen Marshall. Now, what all three of those shows do in the footsteps of the Defenders is they take the law more broadly than Perry Mason does. They talk about social issues. They talk about the role that the attorney has to play in the defense of a client, and the role that the attorney has to play within the law. What you see in these shows are attorneys beginning increasingly to take what you might call unpopular stands on the law. So in Judd's case, and I think Judd is one of the finest legal shows of its kind. It was only on television for 2 years, but it really, as I say, it's one of my favorite shows. It's in my top 10 list of favorite shows of all time. And part of it is because of the power that Carl Betts brings to the role as Clinton Judd. Judd is a high-priced, nationally known defense attorney. So the difference between Perry Mason and the Defenders and Judd for the Defense becomes immediately apparent. Perry Mason is the most famous criminal lawyer in Los Angeles and probably in California as well. But he doesn't really exist outside of that sphere. The Prestons in The Defenders are based in New York, and again, they are well known, but I don't think you would ever call Lawrence Preston famous. Clinton Judd, on the other hand, is famous. He flies all over the country defending clients. He's known in most of the country. He's much more like an F. Lee Bailey type of attorney that he defends prominent defendants, and he gets involved in controversial issues. But what you see, I think, that began with The Defenders crystallizes in a show like Judd, where it is all about the law. And one of the things that you'll see Judd emphasize time and again is that every person is entitled to the protection of the law. That doesn't mean that you have to like them. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. And in fact, there are a couple of cases that Judd takes that he finds extremely distasteful. There's one involving the possibility of homosexuality. There's another that involves defending the freedom of speech of someone. And there's another one, in fact, a very early episode that gets involved with civil rights, where Judd is almost forced to defend a sheriff to whom he takes an instant dislike. Earl Holliman plays the sheriff, and he's a sheriff in a southern town who we would probably consider a redneck, a character that may not be versed in civil rights the way we understand them, the kind of character that you generally set up to hate. And in this case, Judd doesn't like him, doesn't agree with his tactics, doesn't agree with his methods. But in point of fact, setting aside all of the cliches and all of the surface appearances, Judd comes to the conclusion that, well, Judd already will say, regardless of what I think of him, he's a man who's entitled to a fair defense. And as he pursues the case, Judd comes to understand that this man, like him or not, is not guilty of what he's being accused of doing. And so that's one of the things that you learn in watching Judd, is that the law in that sense is truly blind. It doesn't care what kind of a person you are. It doesn't care what you've done in the past. It doesn't care whether you're likable or not, whether your views are repugnant or not. It doesn't care about that. What it cares about is whether or not you're receiving the full benefits and the full protection to which you are entitled by the law. And that results in some ambiguous cases. There are a couple of trials where we never learn whether the client is convicted or acquitted. There are cases where the client is acquitted, but you don't really know whether or not that was the right decision. I'll give you one example because it stands in such stark contrast to what you would see in Perry Mason. There is a case where a young man is accused of I suppose it would be vehicular homicide. Well, he's involved in a car crash. He's accused of murder. The case goes in through the judicial process for a minor. And because he is a minor, 17 years old, I guess. And throughout the entire case, Judd is constantly firing shots at the juvenile legal system. It's not protecting this young man's rights. You're more interested in trying to pin him as a scapegoat. You're not interested in the protecting his rights at all. Well, he winds up being acquitted in the sense that they don't bring the charges against him. But at the end, he is confronted by the one of the members of the juvenile legal system. And Judd says, why did you could have looked into all of these things. Why didn't you do it? And he says, well, let's look at what you've won for this young man. You've exposed that he was involved in a romantic affair with an older married woman. You have exposed 2 or 3 other things about him. Had he simply gone through the juvenile process, none of this would have come to light. He would have gone into, a juvenile rehabilitation center. He would have come out of it. He would have come out of it hopefully better, but intact in some ways regarding his reputation. You exposed all of that during the course of defending him in court. You got the facts, but did you really serve the best interests of your client? And it's left hanging there. I don't think Judd is convinced, but he starts to think about it. Did I really do the right thing for my client? Did I really serve his best interests? And it makes him think. That's a moment of doubt that you never see in a Perry Mason episode. You will see it in The Defenders, but you see it to an increased extent in a show like Judd. So you see him bringing up these unpopular cases, these unpopular causes, and Judd, in a way, serves as what was seen at the time as the bleeding heart of the legal system. Now, why do I use that particular phrase, bleeding heart? Because we're getting into the late 60s and the early 70s now. And I want to digress for just a moment from the shows that we've been talking about, and I want to address kind of a socio-cultural aspect of the legal drama, and that is its relationship to what's actually going on in the real world. Mm-hmm. What we've seen so far, all these legal dramas we're dealing with, are concerning criminal cases. They're not always murder, but they're generally criminal. It's usually the state versus. They're not civil cases, in other words. And what we're finding is that these shows are always taking the side of the defendant. The attorneys are all defense attorneys. We're not seeing the district attorney as the protagonist. We're not seeing the state as being the good guys. We're not seeing the police being defended. We're seeing the defense attorney. And it's doing 2 things. Number one, it's creating doubt in the minds of the viewing public as to the legitimacy of the legal system. There's a paper that the author Stephen Stark, who's written about classic television and its relationship to various aspects of culture. There's a paper that he wrote for a law review where he wonders out loud whether or not Perry Mason actually paved the way for the Warren Court's decisions, particularly the Miranda decision. And he says, this sounds preposterous at first, but it's equally foolish to say that it had no effect at all, because when you watch these dramas, the viewer comes to appreciate the absolute horror of what it must be like to be an innocent person who's accused of a crime and put on trial. Because, as I say, most of these people are innocent. And it's a counterpoint to what we've always seen in the police dramas, where the police are usually correct, where the guilty party is usually prosecuted, and where you see a phrase that comes back time after time after time, which is, if you're not guilty, you don't have anything to worry about. Tell us, tell the police. Why should I? Because what do you have to hide? If you're not guilty, you don't have anything to hide. What we see through these shows from the 60s and into the early 70s is that, yes, in fact, you do have a lot to worry about, even if you're innocent. You have to worry about the police misconstruing what you've said, or if not outright distorting them. You understand that innocent people really don't have a lot of rights, and that the state's going to do everything that it can to convict you regardless of that, and that when you enter the courtroom, you're placing your life in the hands of 12 people who don't know anything about the law and who are going to be influenced by the prosecution. You're going to be relying on what I have termed the single combat warrior. You see one man, the defense attorney, alone, standing up there on your behalf, defending your rights in front of a jury and in front of a judge. Now, that's a very frightening prospect, and that's why it's so important in these shows that you have a defense attorney who is the protagonist, who is the father figure, who is the voice of reason, who is the defender of justice. That's why these become important. And if you talk about the bleeding heart syndrome, which you'll see in a show like Arrest and Trial, or The Young Lawyers, or Men at Law, some of the more relevant legal dramas of the time, you see the attorneys talking about my client's background, his environment, the effects of what he had growing up, what his parents did to him, what his socioeconomic status did to him. And you see the role of the attorney almost becoming that of a social worker in defending where his client is coming from and trying to explain what he grew up with and what effect that might have on him today. What they're really doing is laying the groundwork for the idea that if he is guilty, it's not his crime alone. It's society's crime. It's your crime. It's my crime. It's what we have perpetrated on these innocent victims. And that's what they are. They're not innocent, but they are victims. And what this comes right up against is 1968, 1969, the Nixon administration and the call for law and order. And people begin to acquaint these legal shows with an attack on law and order. One of the reasons these shows fall out of favor in the early 70s is because by this time the defense attorney is no longer the knight in shining armor. He's no longer defending the people who have no one else to defend him. He's an obstructor of justice. He's somebody who's getting in the way of the legal process, and he is, in fact, frustrating the state's efforts to make the streets safer for the ordinary person. You're coddling the criminal. You're not defending an innocent person. You're throwing up technicalities. You're not getting him off on the evidence. And you're not blaming the environment he grew up in. You're making excuses for him.
It's interesting because we'll take a break here in a moment and then come back. When I was hearing you talk about several of these things, a couple of things came to mind. Number one was that the legal system is like nature. It's never going to overexpend energy. If you can get an easy conviction and get the case out of the way, it'll do that all the time. And secondly, when you're talking about the juvenile justice system and that episode of Judds, I remember when I worked at the turn of the century in Hennepin County Juvenile Court, which was trashed by Jesse Ventura when he became governor. It's interesting because I had to go through into the basement, and we had 35, 40-year-old cases that had to be shredded and gotten rid of. And I remember this one particular case in 1971. A teenage girl was accused of shoplifting a sweater at Target. And then over the next 3 years till 1974, a very punitive, retributive judge put her in, at the time, a drug rehabilitation home, foster home. She wasn't doing drugs at the time, but that got her into drugs, got her into worse crime, and then 3 years later she ended up committing suicide. And it's just hearing you say that, it's interesting because this is right around the time these shows, I guess, would have aired. But anyway, that just came to mind. But so, Mitch, you'd mentioned a third show after you spoke about Judge for the Defense and Sam Benedict.
Owen Marshall, Counselor at Law. And that show, the title of it is well considered because you have Arthur Hill playing Owen Marshall. And what he really is a legal version of Marcus Welby. The shows were created by the same person, same production company. In fact, there's even a crossover episode from Marcus Welby to Owen Marshall. And Owen Marshall has yet another aspect of the legal drama involved in it, because increasingly you'll see in Owen Marshall that the dramas never make it into the courtroom at all. So you don't even see him as a litigator. What he is a counselor. And you see him working with people with their legal problems, which are often social problems or individual problems or personality problems or problems with the law. But he is examining different aspects of the law and how they apply in certain issues, and you may never even see the case make it into court. He is the father figure. He is the Marcus Welby of the legal profession. It's a good show. I've enjoyed it when it was on TV, let alone when it was into reruns. But it shows, again, another aspect of the lawyer, which is that he's not in the courtroom at all. And that, in some sense, that's probably a more practical, if not more realistic, a more practical representation of the attorney, because most of what you see go on in the law doesn't happen in the courtroom. It happens outside. And in showing this in Owen Marshall, you get another side of the attorney, and you see him providing that kind of relationship where he becomes a father figure to the client. It didn't run that long, couple seasons, and perhaps it's even better known today that Lee Majors was the young man who was the mentor-student relationship with Arthur Hill. But it's a more gentle show in some respects, but it also tackles, again, those serious social issues that legal dramas are beginning to focus on. Whereas Perry Mason was a whodunit, a mystery. These shows now have evolved to the point where they're not whodunits. They may be whydunits. Why did he do what he did if he's guilty, or how the system responds to it, or how society responds to it. But it kind of brings things into the end of that arc where you had talked earlier about melodramas and courtroom dramas and soap operas. These are, in a way, throwbacks to the golden age type of drama. Not necessarily talking about whether they are great drama or not. We had that golden age discussion before. But what they are human dramas, where the focus is on often on the defendant or the client rather than just the attorney. You learn more about their story, more about their backdrop, more about their history and what's happened to them and how it plays into the larger aspect of what happens with society and the law. So you're introducing or you're finishing up that aspect of it, whereas Perry Mason was a mystery. Judd, Owen Marshall, Sam Benedict, those are dramas. They're not soap operas. They're not trying to get into the aspects of procedurals. They're human dramas. So I'm not saying that to mean that they're better or worse. Yeah. They're just focused on a different aspect.
So, especially in the early 70s with shows like Room 222 and the Mod Squad, we got this influx of young people, yep. Non-white people was suddenly represented to a minor extent at least. Did this affect the courtroom drama as well? Did we have any, major TV lawyers who were black or Hispanic?
Well, what you had was a show. You had a couple of shows that came from this era called The Young Lawyers and Men at Law, which actually began as the Storefront Lawyers. Neither one of them was very successful, and there are a couple of good reasons why they weren't successful. One is because they were involving young lawyers. They were just out of the law school. They were trying to bring justice to the poor, the downtrodden, the ghettos, the people who are usually overlooked in the legal process. So in that respect, they much more resemble a show like East Side, West Side, where George C. Scott was playing a social worker. These young people are equal parts social worker and lawyer, and they always have an older mentor, whether it's Lee J. Cobb or somebody else. It's one of the shows that you could compare the young lawyers to is The Interns, and it's a similar type of a situation. You notice, by the way, how often you see this relationship between medical dramas and legal dramas, and it's not just the setup. It's this establishment kind of vibe, whether you're having an older doctor slash lawyer mentoring a younger doctor slash lawyer, but you're looking at in the medical drama, it can be a case of trying new techniques, of reaching outside, of going to find the root causes of disease and illness, or of trying alternative versions of medicine. In the legal drama, it's very similar. You're trying to find the root causes of crime, the relationship between the socioeconomic condition of a person and their propensity towards breaking the law, and you're trying to look outside of the traditional aspect of the law to find out what its role really is. You get sort of a hint of that in even as far back as The Defenders, where Lawrence finds himself in chambers with the judge, and the judge is essentially saying, you're trying to bring aspects into the courtroom that don't belong there, whether it's the social background of the client or whatever. These don't belong in the courtroom. Those aren't our issues. And Preston responds, they are for me, and they ought to be for you as well. And that's what you're getting in these shows as well. The storefront lawyers, it is literally what it's saying it is. It's these young lawyers going out and opening a storefront law office where they're defending people who don't have a chance to be defended any other way. Now, they're interesting in a certain respect. They're very formulaic. They're also very preachy. And they're presenting lawyers who are so painfully earnest that you have to think to yourself that if they were in a real courtroom, they'd be chewed up and spit out by an experienced litigator. But besides that, you remember how I said about Owen Marshall, counselor at law,
Yeah.
that an important part of his role was as a counselor. These kids can't counsel you. They don't know enough about real life themselves, let alone be able to provide you with that counsel. What they're there to do is to speak up for you when nobody else would. That's a good thing. But they would probably be more apt to do it as the conscience of a firm rather than as an actual defender in court. And in fact, you see the storefront lawyers morph into a series called Men at Law, where they are still the young lawyers, but now they're being mentored directly by the same firm that one of the characters left to begin the series in the first place. And so they're realizing that these young lawyers can't cut it on their own with the audience. They have to be brought into the establishment somehow to be given the benefit of the experience and the wisdom that the elders have toward the younger people. So as an idea, as an equivalent to the Mod Squad, I think it's kind of a flop, because you don't really have what makes the defense attorney so compelling in a drama. You don't have it in these shows, and consequently they don't last more than a portion of a season. They're roasted by the critics, they're ignored by the viewers, and they disappear. And it's interesting that when you have an effort to bring the legal drama back in the early 70s, what does CBS do? They, having failed with the storefront lawyers, they go to the new Perry Mason mysteries. They bring Monty Markham in to take the place of Raymond Burr. You have Sharon Acker as Dust Street. You have an entirely new cast, but you're going back to the tried and true formula of the defense attorney as the single combat warrior, heroically defending the innocent party. So what they're trying to do is it's not a reboot. It's not a reinvention. It's just a remake. That doesn't work either, but it's because there is only one Perry Mason, and that's Raymond Burr. All due respect to Monty Markham, who's a fine actor and whom I like, but he's not Perry Mason. Raymond Burr is, so that flops as well. But it's an interesting approach in that, in a sense, the network is now trying to go back to the formula that worked in the past instead of adopting this more relevant type of role. You're just looking at an updated version of the old drama.
And I would assume that Raymond Burr was busy with Ironside at the time, and that was more of a standard police show.
Yes. Ironside was. It's interesting because for those people who look at It's About TV at my blog, I have an issue that will be coming up on the 20th of July. That's when the post will be going up. But it's going back to 1965, 66, that era, where we're looking at what turns out to be the final season of Perry Mason. Raymond Burr is on the cover of TV Guide. He's talking about his responsibilities as an actor to the way he presents the law on television, and which he takes very seriously. He speaks to a lot of bar associations, as does Carl Betts, by the way, as Clinton Judd. He's another actor who took the role very seriously and spoke to a lot of bar associations about the role of the lawyer. But in passing, there's a comment that the author of the piece, and I think it was Dwight Whitney, there's a comment that he makes about Burr, that he said it was easy to imagine that he would be going on as Perry Mason forever, looking for that great final season where the show could go out on a high, that he would be still defending cases when he was in a wheelchair. And this is before Ironside. This is before Mason goes off the air. It's very interesting that he refers to Raymond Burr sleuthing around in a wheelchair defending people, which is precisely what happens when you get to a series like Ironside, where he is the prototypical what we like to think of the police really doing, which is not just prosecuting the guilty, but defending the innocent and getting down to the bottom of it. So, yeah, that's why it's interesting that when Mason comes back for his second comeback, the first one being the new Perry Mason with Monty Markham, when he comes back for the second time as the Perry Mason movies, it is with Raymond Burr, and though most fans of the show do not consider them canonical, they follow the same format, the lawyer as detective. He's doing less of that himself. He's relying more on his associate by this time, but it's still the same Perry and Della, and it's still the same formula that you saw in the TV series.
Now, Markham didn't play Mason, or did he play his son or something?
No. It was in the sense of talking about a reboot. It was it took the same characters. It had Mason, Della, Paul Drake, Tragg, and Berger. They were just all played by different actors.
Okay, so I know, for example, by the mid 70s, during Watergate, there was the financial meltdown, the Arab oil crisis, the malaise, supposedly, of Jimmy Carter. And I know in terms of cop shows, oftentimes Barney Miller, a sitcom, was said to be the most authentic cop show out there. And similarly, after that went off the air, a couple of years later came Night Court in the mid 80s, which for its first year at least was given high marks for having some of the wacky kind of things that happened in those situations in a real night court. Again, it went way over the top later on. But between these shows of the earnest early 70s and something like Night Court, did any what TV courtroom dramas came along that pushed any boundaries or brought something new?
I might be overlooking something, but I can't really think of very many. You know, there was the Paper Chase, which isn't a courtroom drama. It's about preparing people to become lawyers, but it's not. You know, it's really an academic. It's more like Room 222 than anything else. There's a series called The Associates, a comedy that Martin Short is one of the associates and Wilfred Hyde White is the senior partner. And oddly enough, it actually exists in the same universe as The Paper Chase, because John Houseman brings his character from The Paper Chase into The Associates, where he's the nemesis of Wilfred Hyde White, who makes this wonderful comment about Houseman's character, where he says, well, you remember how it is, those who can do, those who can't teach. And I thought it's probably as devastating a put down of Houseman's character as you're ever going to find. But so that's an effort to bring the Barney Miller type idea into the legal system. You have a show like Petrocelli, which really, again, is, even though it's a courtroom drama, what it does is, I think, it picks up more on this idea of the lawyer as detective rather than the lawyer as adjudicator or as a jurist. It follows up on this idea that lawyers are always also investigating to try to find out who the real culprit is. And one of the points that people have made in looking about the history of legal shows on TV is that the defense attorney has what could be considered a low bar to have to meet up. He doesn't, as I mentioned earlier, he doesn't need to show the innocence of his client. He merely needs to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that his client is not guilty. All of these lawyers in the most compelling of these Perry Mason style courtroom dramas seem to find even that too high to aspire to. It's almost as if they feel like, I can't defend the client other than to show who the guilty party truly is. And I find that, and a lot of people have found that a kind of a remarkable thing to do. As I say, you can think of defending someone as a low bar, just reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is not always that hard to prove. And what it really does is it forces the prosecution to show that there is an overwhelming preponderance of evidence to suggest someone's guilt. And you don't even need to show a preponderance of evidence. You need to prove it beyond the reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean that he's probably guilty. If he's probably guilty, he's not guilty as far as the law is concerned. You've got to go beyond that probably guilty. You have to go to the point where, well, the only way I can imagine that he is guilty is not guilty is if somebody perfects an invisibility shield or something like that. You have to come up with a defense that is so based on something that is unreasonable that the average person can't accept it as a legitimate defense. So a lawyer of Perry Mason's stature should be able to demonstrate his client's innocence without having to show who the guilty party really is. And in fact, there are a couple of episodes. There are two that I'm thinking of specifically, one in Sam Benedict and um, one in the Defenders, where they win either a directed verdict or an acquittal for their client, and the episode ends without you ever knowing who killed the person. And you're left wondering, well, if the defendant didn't do it, who did? But that wasn't the point of the episode. The point of the episode was either to show how the legal system is being abused, or how the investigation was bungled, or how this of the facts of the defendant's life that put them in this position that they were in. But the point was never to try to find out who did it. The point was to demonstrate that this person didn't do it. And they're able to do that through the reasonable clause, the reasonable doubt clause. And so that's something that I find endlessly fascinating in looking at these dramas, is the idea that somehow the defense attorney is obligated to find out who the guilty party is, that he's obligated to do the police department's work for them. There's a pull quote before we get to the next part of this. There's a pull quote from Time magazine in 1958 that I ran across when I was doing a little reading on this topic for today. And the pull quote shows the effect that legal dramas of the 50s and the early 60s were having on the viewer. And it says that these shows seem to suggest that, one, any citizen would be stupid to leave an important matter to the police, and that, two, a little misdemeanor can be a good thing if applied in a good cause. In other words, if you've got to break into somebody's place to find the evidence, well, you know, that's okay, because what you're really doing is showing somebody's innocence. But that's the part of the takeaway that we have from these shows, that we see that the crime fighting abilities of the state are called into question, that the attorney himself is the chief detective. That makes for entertaining TV, and it can pull out some important judicial points. But that's why you have a show like The Defenders or Sam Benedict or Judd or Owen Marshall. That's why these shows exist, which is to get away from the idea that the attorney has to answer all the questions. And as the pendulum swings, as we see the reaction to the bleeding heart type of show come on, you'll get to see a show like The DA, which was one of Robert Conrad's many one-season series that he did. Failed series, I suppose you could say, if you weren't being kind about Robert Conrad. He did a lot of them, but let's face it, that it's only a bankable star who will get the opportunity to try and fail so many times. But The DA was another effort to put the prosecutor at the heart of the show, to show the dedicated public servant who's out there trying to make the streets safer and to convict the guilty people. And why doesn't a show like that succeed? I think it's because, you know, if we're talking about the evolution of legal dramas, obviously a show about a defense attorney is much more compelling than a show about a prosecutor. And part of it is because it's very easy for the average person to envision themselves as being falsely accused of a crime. I think it's a nightmare we all have. But it's much more difficult to find where you're putting yourself when you're talking about a show where the prosecutor is the hero. You don't see yourself as the defendant, because that person's guilty and you're not. You don't really see yourself as the prosecutor either, because you don't have the ability and the skills to be able to prove who is guilty. What you wind up viewing yourself as is the fawning public who admires the ability of the prosecutor to be able to keep the streets safe. That man is fighting for me. That's the way you're looking at it. And it's a lot easier to do in a police drama where you're seeing the police sort through the evidence and you're trying to find out who the guilty party is. A whodunit is something that anybody can participate in. You're trying to figure out who the guilty person is, whether it's a legal drama or a private detective series. But when it comes to making the prosecutor the hero, that's a little more difficult to do because you necessarily have to cast the defense as the bad guy. And that takes away from your ability to admire the defense as the people you need when you're in trouble.
So what year was the DA?
Mid to late 70s, I would say.
So we're talking then probably about a 10, 12-year sort of desert. And the two shows that come to mind in the 1980s, at least for me as someone who wasn't really into this genre, would be L.A. Law and then Matlock. Matlock sort of was like a bizarre cross between Mason and Columbo with a twang. And L.A. Law was supposedly to be a more realistic show along the lines of Hill Street Blues, which was considered revolutionary at the time. But it seemed to descend to, in my mind, to more of a soap opera through the years. So if you have a comment on either of those shows or any other shows in the 80s that are overlooked?
Well, I think that you hit it right on the nose, especially with the L.A. Law idea, that what L.A. Law does that these other shows haven't done is bring the private lives of the attorneys into focus. And that's what makes it, I think, a soap opera. The shows themselves, the cases tend to be more melodramatic, and I think that's something that you see even when you come to more present-day shows like Boston Legal or The Good Wife or The Good Fight. You have more sensational types of cases that are being involved, but the emphasis is equally on the individuals involved, the lawyers. And again, to contrast that with with Perry Mason, we get to see Mason's apartment occasionally. Every time we see it, he's reading one of his legal books, or he's working on one of his briefs. The man works almost all the time in the office, but even when he's at home, he's at work. You don't see him watching TV or doing anything relaxing. He doesn't have a social life except when he takes Della to dinner or to a cocktail party or a play, and even then he winds up getting into the middle of the case. He's always approached by somebody. So Perry Mason has no home life. None of these other attorneys, whether it's Benedict or Judd or Marshall or the Prestons, none of them have home lives to speak of. It may intrude a little bit, but it isn't really about them. It's about their cases.
Although Robert Reed did end up with 6 kids to compensate in the next show.
Yes, he did. We'll get into that topic someday too. But yes,
maybe overcompensating.
Yeah, I think so. He does have a girlfriend in the first season of The Defenders, but even that goes away. There's no room for anything like that. You have to understand, when you're posing for the next statue of blind justice, there's no room for a personal life. But that's the difference where you get to a show like L.A. Law. It's about the people, and it's about the lawyers, and it is a soap opera. And that doesn't mean that they can't have some interesting legal points, but it's a soap opera, and it's also about the politics of the firm. You notice that these shows that we're talking about, I'm going to get back to Matlock in a minute, but these shows that we're talking about that are the spawn of L.A. Law are almost all set in large firms where there's a lot of politics going on about what position you have, who the senior partners and junior partners are. It's really, it's Mad Men, but it's in a legal setting instead of a PR setting, or you could say vice versa, but it's the same type of story. Perry Mason had no partners that we know of. Benedict and Judd and Marshall have associates. They aren't full-fledged partners. They may be someday, but they're associates. So there's that teaching area that's involved. Defenders has that built in with the father and son. Matlock is another show that is like that. You have Matlock, you have his trusted associates, whether they are fellow lawyers or investigators, private investigators, but Matlock himself is just Ben Matlock, and you're right. It's Perry Mason with a Southern twang, and it's no coincidence that the people who made Matlock also do the Perry Mason movies when Raymond Burr comes back to the role. It's very formulaic. It's very entertaining. He always has to uncover the real killer at the end, and they're always murders. So we're back to the lawyer as a whodunit, as a detective, and what's interesting about that is that if you look at real lawyers, and I'm going to pull out F. Lee Bailey again, Bailey started his legal career providing investigative services for criminal lawyers before he became a trial lawyer himself. I think his firm was called Investigative Associates, and I might be getting that wrong, but the point is that the role of the private detective or the role of the investigator as helping the attorney prepare his case is a real and important role. So somebody like Paul Drake is important to a series. The investigator is very real, but what that presupposes is that the attorney himself doesn't do a lot of that investigative work. That's where you see some of the difference in a show like Mason or Petrocelli or Matlock. The lawyer himself is not going to go out there most of the time and go through the open window and find the key evidence. They don't need to do that. That's what they employ private detectives for. And in the Defenders, I think you see a good use of that, in that it's the younger attorney. It's Robert Reed who does a lot of that legwork that a private investigator might do otherwise. It's not E.G. Marshall, who is the lawyer, who is the main focus of the trial itself. So, there's an interesting dynamic there. And I think sometime it might actually be interesting if you do a series about the chief investigator in a law firm. Not the lawyer themselves. The lawyer could be a secondary character, but the chief investigator for a lawyer. That might be an interesting idea. It would be crossing the procedural and the legal series and the whodunit all in one. But you're absolutely correct. Coming back to Matlock is it's applying the tried and true formula. LA Law is the soap opera.
So the 90s saw the rise of cable television, HBO, and a handful of other channels. That took a few years to get their feet wet, but then pretty much over the last quarter century or so, most of what people would consider quality television is claimed to be not on the free networks, but on the HBO and these cable networks that you pay for. You mentioned Mad Men, The Sopranos, and that ilk. Was there did the cable shows bring anything new to the table in terms of the courtroom drama, and if so, how did that affect any network shows?
Well, I think that a show like Better Call Saul, which is a spin-off from Breaking Bad, that is loosely considered a legal drama, and I suppose it is, but it's the lawyer as anti-hero. It's the lawyer as scoundrel, if not criminal. It's the lawyer as the unethical cop. So that is a bold departure from Perry Mason. It's a bold departure, in fact, from any of these other shows, because although Mason was willing to bend the envelope to the breaking point and sometimes over it. He wasn't unethical. He just was wanting to make sure his client was getting the same breaks as the state. But a show like Better Call Saul goes far beyond that. And I think that the reboot of Perry Mason that HBO, I think it was, did a couple of years ago, I never saw it. I wouldn't have any desire to see it because it's a completely different Perry Mason. It's as far away from the original concept of Perry Mason as the Mission Impossible movies are from the original TV series. I would look at two shows that you might have that especially there's a show that's probably overlooked, which is Showtime's effort to reboot The Defenders, and they do it with the same name and with E.G. Marshall returning in the same role. Robert Reed is not in the series, but E.G. Marshall is, and he's still Lawrence Preston, and he's got some relatives in it, and he's still the patriarch of the firm, but it is trying to follow in the footsteps of the original Defenders in that its emphasis is on the social issues, on the crusade against social ills, insofar as the lawyer is able to play a role in it. And they did 3 TV movies. Essentially, the reboot ended when E.G. Marshall died. That precluded the possibility of any more Defenders movies, and so they didn't make any more. But that was actually pretty well regarded by people as a worthy successor to the original Defenders. And I think if E.G. Marshall had lived, or if they had been able to establish the show as being able to stand on its own without him, I think that might have been an interesting variation on it that would have continued that tradition. The other show that pops to mind is The Good Wife, which was probably the legal drama that started out on CBS, ended on CBS when Julia McGinnis left, but then becomes The Good Fight, a spin-off without the main character, but with all of the other characters, and that becomes a cable-only series that, maybe, I can't remember if CBS showed any episodes of it during the pandemic when they ran out of scripted dramas to show, but that's a show that makes not the transition of being a cable show that affects network TV, but vice versa. It's a network show that goes to cable or goes to streaming, and that, I think I put that kind of a show in the same category with L.A. Law. It's part soap opera, it's part crusading show. What it really is, more than anything else, is like the Law and Order franchise. And I know we've not touched on that, because the original Law and Order is a hybrid of police procedural and legal drama. The spin-offs from Law and Order tend to focus almost entirely on the procedural aspect of it. And Law and Order is an attempt to combine the shows. There was another attempt. There was a show I alluded to earlier in this program called Arrest and Trial, which was on in the early 60s. It was a show I think we've talked about before, maybe, but it had Ben Gazzara as a detective, and it had Chuck Connors as a defense attorney. And it was a 90-minute show that the first 45 minutes showed the police investigation, the arrest. The last 45 minutes showed the trial, where you had the defendant who had been arrested by the police going on trial and being defended by Chuck Connors. Now, the one flaw in this show should be obvious from the very beginning, which is that every week one of the two protagonists of the show has to be wrong. Either the cops arrested the wrong guy, or the Chuck Connors is defending a guilty person. They got around that in a pretty clever method, which was by making Connors the kind of attorney who talked about the environment, again, the environment in which the defendant grew up, to show why he was the way he was. And the flip side of that was that they made Gazzara's detective a bleeding heart, in a college graduate, which was very unusual for a policeman at the time on TV. He was a college graduate. He had his own doubts about the role of the law. He understood his job was not to prosecute the guilty, not to prove somebody that was guilty, but simply to arrest them and establish the probable cause. But he often would have second thoughts about that, or have doubts about the guilt of the person he arrested. And so he would, on occasion, even talk Connors into defending the person he had just arrested. And it makes for, at times, compelling, but ultimately flawed attempt to merge these two. Law and Order does it better, because in this case, the trial aspect of the show is not with the defense attorney, but with the prosecutor. And so you have the police picking up the suspect, and then you have the prosecutors attempting to convict the suspect. Law and Order is an outgrowth of the Law and Order movement. I mentioned the effect that Nixon's fight on crime, well, actually, the crime that resulted in Nixon's call for law and order, kind of putting the kibosh on the legal dramas of the 60s and 70s. As somebody said once, that in television's history, when the police rise in TV esteem, lawyers fall correspondingly. And so you have that yin and yang, that when the police procedurals are big stuff, the legal dramas are not. And that's because people are more interested in the conviction than they are in the acquittal. And so that's what Law and Order tries to do. They reintroduce the concept of the DA as the hero, and they do it much more effectively than some of the other examples, like the DA that I had mentioned earlier. They do it effectively, though, because you've already seen the investigation, and you've already had the chance to demonstrate the likely guilt of the defendant. I hate Law and Order, and someday maybe we can devote a whole show to Law and Order and its devilish spawn, because I think that Law and Order is an aspect of everything that is wrong about the police procedural, in terms of treating the public as this annoyance that has to be defended. But, you know, we don't really want to do it. We want to clear the books. We want to get these people off. We'll use whatever means that we can to do it. And if we have to convict an innocent person occasionally, well, that's what you have to do if you're going to enforce the law.
I had mentioned earlier my experience working in a Hennepin County juvenile court almost a quarter of a century ago, and I never liked the Law and Order show. I watched maybe 4 or 5 episodes in the first year or so, and it just turned me off. Not only that, but it seems that it went back to the Joe Friday kind of approach, this sort of simple-minded. It's like trying to take a nuanced, real drama of quality, like, say, Mad Men, which I think is one of at least the first 2 or 3 years before it descended into terrible soap opera, was one of the better cable shows. But imagine like taking a show like that and just putting it back well, anyway, I wanted to speak.
SVU is even worse, but that's a topic for another day.
I wanted to speak of 2 1990 shows, one that was mentioned, one that wasn't, one that I think was absolutely terrible, and one that I think was good but then let itself slide. The first one is JAG, which is rarely mentioned, and it takes an unusual premise in that it's set in a totally military, crimes committed by the military, within the military, handled by, as Donald Trump said he might want to do to some of his opponents, a military tribunal. And the second one was David Kelly's follow-up to Picket Fences, which I thought was one of the better shows of the 1990s, and that became Boston Legal, I believe. which morphed into the Spader and Shatner show. And I think that show had potential, but it was just so goddamn quirky, and it reminded me of a couple of episodes that I saw of a show that Nip and Tuck about doctors that do that. It became like that. So Jag, I think, was terrible from the beginning because it was sort of like Magnum PI meets. There was just something. What are your takes on those two 1990s Spawn?
I'm not going to argue with you on Jag, because I think that it's trying to, what it really is a recruiting poster for the armed forces, cloaked in the guise of a legal drama. What was interesting about Boston Legal, if you look at its original show, and you alluded to this, originally it was a series called Murder One. And Murder One was an extremely interesting idea. I thought this was one of the best ideas for a new series that I'd seen in a long time. It was the idea of taking a high-profile murder case and doing an entire season around it, instead of just having the case of the week, which is what we'd all had previously, and if we were lucky, it was maybe a 3 or 4 show story arc. This was the idea of doing an entire season just about one case. So you got to see it all the way from the crime through the investigation, the arrest, the indictment, the discovery process, everything that goes into preparing a case for the defense, and then the trial itself. Now, I think that it's been, and it had a very attractive lead at the beginning too. I don't remember his name, but he was a very interesting character. It got into soap opera-ish at the
Dylan
end.
McDermott?
I think it was even before him.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up. Maybe I can do it and talk at the same time. I have my doubts sometimes. But the problem that Murder One had was that it was unable to sustain the drama for the entire length of the series. And perhaps Daniel Benzali, that's who he was.
Yes. Not that the bald guy.
Yes.
Yes. That's where Boston Legal came from?
It did. It was well, kind of. I think it kind of did. I might be mixing things up, because what they had, the second season, he's out, and Lepage is in as the next one, and they kind of change it. I suppose that Boston Legal isn't, strictly speaking, a spin-off from that. What I'm probably doing is conflating the two in terms of their status as TV dramas. So yeah, I'm gonna at least partially take back what I just said, in the sense of thinking that they ran on a singular line. I'm gonna conflate them, though, in terms of what they became. And what you were talking about was the idea of a single case morphing into the idea of 2 or 3 cases in its second season, going into the whole Boston Legal premise of the law firm. And I think maybe what I'm doing, in having read some of the trade papers of the time and some of the websites of the time, what I'm probably thinking of is the idea that they attempted to take the Murder One idea and redo it into another show. So maybe that's what I'm doing. If anybody's read my blog, where I talked once about how you always go on a show like this and you're afraid you're going to be uncovered as knowing far less about TV than you pretend to. This may be one of those cases where I'm kind of talking off the top of my head and thinking that these two shows are the same, and they aren't. Yeah, they aren't, because what I'm really doing is spinning. Boston Legal is actually a spin-off from The Practice.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
and not Murder One. But I think that there are enough similarities between Murder One and the practice in terms of the times in which the shows were made, that you're looking at an attempt to bring them.
right. And I think it was the practice that started in the '90s, and then
Yes.
Boston Legal in the O's, and
Yeah.
McDermott was, I think, the lead of the practice.
Yeah. And
And
James
that
Spader.
also descended into a bit of a soap opera. They had that sexy English gal who I guess slept around with all the different lawyers, was sort of passed around.
Well,
Uh,
that's the problem with all of these shows. Now I'm gonna take Boston Legal and The Practice and Murder One and all of them and just lump them together for the moment in terms of what they're all about, because the problems are that these shows followed the trend that was very popular to this day of an ensemble cast rather than a show that stars one focal character. They're an ensemble cast, which means they all have their own storylines, they all have their own quirks, they all have their own personalities, and you have to try to keep track of them at the same time that you may be talking about a case which ultimately is incidental to the entire idea of the show. So the practice and Boston Legal are about the lawyers. Again, I picked on that before when we were talking about LA Law. They can easily get into soap opera if you're not careful, and they can shunt the trial off to a secondary aspect because they're dealing with something that's quite realistic, actually, which is that a law firm handles multiple cases at the same time. Lawyers handle multiple cases at the same time. So unless you're involved in a very high-profile drama, an actual case, unless you're involved in defending somebody who is in a high-profile thing like the O.J. Simpson case, the Jack Ruby case, Sam Shepard case, you don't always have one client at a time. And you usually get postponements, and you arrange your schedule so that you can concentrate on one thing when it's going on otherwise. And so if you've got multiple lawyers in a firm, they're handling multiple cases, and you're showing them as multiple story threads through the show. And so that means they aren't courtroom dramas as much as they are dramas about the lawyers in the courtroom. I don't find that particularly interesting. They're also much more cynical than the shows of the past were, whereas the Defenders is showing the purity of the law as the ultimate adjudicator of right and wrong, good and evil, rather than emotions. These shows are delving into the law as a cynical type thing, where you're often being asked to make decisions that are the lesser of evils, or you're talking about how you go through jury prep and try to pick the jurors that are going to be most amenable to the kinds of cases that you're going to be building. That's not to say that that isn't a more realistic look at how the shows are, how the legal system is. That's not to say that you're not presenting the law as it actually is, but it is making for a different kind of experience, a more cynical kind of experience than what you saw in these previous series. And I'm not necessarily convinced that that's a good way to do things. That's just me talking, not even me as a historian. But I don't really know if a certain amount of cynicism is good, but I don't know if it's good to cast such a wide net over everything that you wind up causing people to lose their confidence, their faith in every institution they have. Isn't it bad enough when we get that on the news without having it reinforced on television drama?
Yeah, so let's wrap up then, and we're talking about 70 years on television plus a couple more decades maybe on radio. So The courtroom drama now is probably nearing, if not at the century mark. Can you pull out one or two things that you think? I mean, because the successes are rather obvious. We spend most of the show talking about what made some of these shows good.
Uh-huh.
What do you think have been the weaknesses of this genre generally? And is there anything specific? Is it that they are often behind the curve of society? Is it that they do tend to fall into soap opera territory? What are the ailments, and is there a way to cure that, do you think, going forward?
Yeah, the short answer is yes to all of those things. You're right. I think to expand on it just a little further, one of the drawbacks I think of legal series is the idea that you can conclusively prove someone's guilt or innocence in a court of law. That doesn't usually happen. And by that, what I mean is the defendant is innocent. Here's the guilty party. That almost never happens. I think that's a drawback. I think another drawback is the idea that science can answer everything. I read about a particular case that happened in the early 60s where the defendant was acquitted, and they talked to the jurors about it afterwards, and one of them said, well, they didn't introduce any fingerprint evidence, and they always convict people based on fingerprints on TV. So if they didn't do anything with fingerprints, I figured the guy couldn't be guilty. That's appalling. But so I think that the idea that the law is a sacrosanct thing that somehow or other stands above all of our other institutions and provides something that is pure and noble, I think that it's dangerous for people to start to believe that too much. It's also unrealistic. That's why I said a little cynicism is a good thing. And I think that you can't, just as you can't have a show that's totally cynical, you can't have a show that's totally altruistic either. I think the strength of legal dramas is that they show the need for us to respect the rights of the individual, and that people are entitled to a fair trial, and that just because you're accused of something doesn't mean that you're guilty, and that a lawyer's greatest obligation is to the law itself. And if we are today too cynical enough to recognize that that isn't often the way it is, that doesn't mean that that isn't the way it should be. So I think these shows do provide a service by reminding us of what the law should be. But too often they either give us an idealized version or a cynical version or something that is other than what it really is. What it is, however, is great entertainment. I think that legal shows are tremendously compelling. As unrealistic as Perry Mason may be, it's very good at giving you the idea of what the law ought to be, and as a mystery, as a whodunit, it's terrific stuff. It's what a television show should be about, and at the same time, it can provoke some deep thoughts. I think the shows that followed it, those ones that I've really praised, like The Defenders or Judd, that make you think even more, do an even better job at it. I think that it is too bad that television in general and these legal dramas in particular have devolved into soap operas. I think it is too bad that they feel like they have to present cases that are so quirky and so weird and so offbeat, and characters that are equally quirky and weird and all offbeat. Hey, I realize that that's what sells, but I think it is unfortunate that we have to go to something like that. And I think that as an aficionado of legal dramas, as somebody who enjoys courtroom dramas, whether they were in the movies or on television, I don't see a show like that that's on TV now, and I haven't for quite some time. And I'm not sure that we'll ever get back to that, because I think the whole concept of entertainment on television has evolved so much that the kind of thing that I advocate is probably considered either corny or too intellectual. And I don't mean that to speak well of me, as in saying that I want shows that are too smart for the average guy, but I think that perhaps my time has passed as far as what sells on TV. I might be too old for what people really want on TV nowadays, but I think that, that's the long and the short of it. Some of these shows do a really good job of being entertaining. Some of them do a really good job of presenting ideas. Some of them do a really good job at showing what the flaws are with the legal system. And I don't know if we'll see them again.
I know far less about this particular aspect of television than you do. I mean, I know less about television in general than you do. I'm more of an educated fan rather than a dedicated history buff like yourself.
Yeah, sometimes there are people who would disagree with you on that.
But
They would look at some of the boners I pulled and say, "This guy knows nothing."
but going back to my own experience working for less than a year in a court system, I think one of the problems is inherently that the law, in order to be good, cannot be dramatic. Drama is based upon these great this is a mistake, this is these declarative statements, whereas reality, you have to sift through things. I mentioned this girl who stole a sweater and then ended up becoming a drug addict and committing suicide in the course of a few years because of a system that didn't give a shit about her. She was a poor girl, a poor white girl actually, and it's hard to make that dramatic without falling into these conventions of the soap opera and stuff. There's the old saying, I think it's from Japan, that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And it's that way in law too. If like, I generally have a big mouth, and if I saw something, I was working just as a file clerk, and if I saw something that fell out or something that was missing, and get rid of this guy. He's a pain in the ass. He's just a file clerk, that kind of thing. And I think if you were to try to attempt to make a legal drama, you would have to focus in total. If you're working in a court system, or if you're working in a legal defense team, a big corporation like that, you'd have to have a large cast of characters, and of course that's going to be prohibitively expensive too. So you have to have the white knight that's going in there.
Yep.
And so I think that the legal drama is an inherently melodramatic thing. I mean, I think it just has to be, because you don't want to be looking through, like this girl I mentioned, 400 pages, and I put it aside several days as I was clearing out and shredding thousands of things, and on my breaks I would read 20 pages at a time, and to get to this young girl's life who was shunted by the system. That's not Perry Mason. This is the slow grinding wheels of the behemoth of justice that just it doesn't make for so those shows that have succeeded have done so against far longer odds than other types of shows, I think.
Well, I've always been interested in the law. When I was young, I wanted to be an attorney or a lawyer when I grew up. And when I was in high school, I read law books, and my minor in college was pre-law. I decided not to pursue it, but I've always had an interest in the law, and to this day, when I'm watching these legal dramas and they're getting into some of the technicalities of the law and how the law operates, I find that fascinating. It reminds me of why I loved the law in the first place and why I gravitate toward these kinds of things, whether you're talking about the kind of credentials that you have to have when you become an expert witness, or when you talk about the technicalities of being able to object, or to have the poison fruit theory that some evidence that's illegally obtained can still be used if the evidence itself is genuine, something like that, or whether when you have fingerprints on a weapon, where do they have to be on the weapon in order for them to be shown that they were using the object as a weapon and not simply holding it to polish it? That kind of stuff still fascinates me, but I'm also aware that most of the intricacies of the law that interest me the most are things that the average viewer would find the dullest part of trying to provide a compelling drama.
Yeah.
So I realize too, I agree with you completely, there has to be a suspension of disbelief to have a successful legal drama. That's why Perry Mason is such compelling television. It's why the three series that I centered on, Judd and Sam Benedict and Owen Marshall and The Defenders, those shows I find so tremendously compelling because they deal with, they at least put the law in a realistic environment, even if they don't deal with it as realistically as you and I might know that the law operates. They at least bring it into a social milieu that causes you to ask questions. You watch a court-martial drama on TV and you ask yourself the question, should an American citizen be forced to give up certain legal rights he has when he joins the military? Should he be forced to sit in front of a court-martial rather than a civilian jury? Or is a true jury of his peers still the civilian rather than the military person? Those are the kinds of questions I love to see brought up. And I think that courtroom dramas can do that as well as, if not better than any other form of drama, without having to go into the minutia so much that makes it boring TV. But that's why you accept it as an archetypical show. It creates icons and archetypes rather than realistic portrayals. That doesn't mean that the issues they deal with can't still be realistic. I think the one you were talking about the girl who became the drug addict through the legal system, I think that would make a tremendously compelling movie. Because you'd be able to spend time on it and only it. But would it work as an episode within a TV series, within the confines of the legal drama? Probably not.
Well, on that note, we'll end. We'll be back in a few more weeks with some other aspect of television yet to be decided. So, Mitch,
Looking
thanks.
forward to it.
Thanks. We'll get on it, and thanks again, Mitch.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thanks.